This is a lecture on the Great Depression. This will cover Section 2, Part 4. So let's look at some of the critical terms we're going to come across. So we have bonus certificates. Now this was deferred compensation for World War I veterans. And it was an interest-bearing long-term insurance policy that would not be payable until 1945. Now, it was based on their length of service. It was calculated at $1 per day if you were remaining in the United States during World War I, and $1.25 if you were serving overseas. Polio is a crippling and potentially dangerous and very infectious disease known for causing paralysis in its victims. There is no cure for polio, but as of now, it is preventable through vaccination. When we talk about airships, we are talking about a powered, lighter than air aircraft that uses a gas lighter than air, like helium or hydrogen, to achieve lift. This allows the craft to basically float, and it is steered using engines and rudders. The largest were commonly known as rigid airships and were constructed with a structural frame. Now, for the most part, the largest one of those being the Hindenburg was measured at 804 feet long, and it maintained a diameter of 135 feet. This is almost as big as the RMS Titanic. So with the Great Depression in full swing, we need to keep in mind that as the markets collapse, manufacturers, of course, cut production and in turn cut jobs. And this brought a reduction in consumer spending, which only forced hundreds of other businesses to close. If you were one of these individuals who lost a job, it is important to remember that you lacked unemployment insurance or any form of public relief. The welfare programs that we have today did not exist back then. So a loss of a job meant immediate catastrophe for the average citizen. Additionally, because of over-farming, we're going to see that low food prices seriously hurt agricultural industries. And this caused the closure of numerous farms, thereby increasing the number of unemployed workers nationwide. As stated, the Depression is going to affect not just the United States, but Europe. And it does so because without US loans, Germany is going to default on its reparations, which then only forces England and France to be unable to repay their debts to the United States. We're going to see that reduced trade with Europe resulted in continued economic collapse among all the nations. And mutual attempts to increase tariffs in order to gain more money from exports only fueled the economic crisis. The Great Depression spread worldwide and created economic and political turmoil throughout the world. And we're going to see that these tensions that had been building up before and after the First World War intensified throughout Europe. And this affected nearly every country with a decline in industrial production, trade, and living standards. As you can expect, the Great Depression renewed tensions between the working class and the elite. But now we're going to see that this tension included members of the middle class who were also possible victims of the economic depression. Bank foreclosures on homes added to the growing homeless population throughout the country. Working class and many frightened middle class Americans pushed for economic and political reforms. They demanded corporations be required increased regulation, and they sought government protections from corporate schemes. We'll see that women entered the workforce in increasing numbers to compensate for the lost income of their husbands and or fathers. As the situation grew worse, in 1932, former servicemen caught up in the Depression asked Congress to redeem their bonus certificates. 15,000 veterans called the Bonus Expeditionary Force, also known as the Bonus Army, marched into Washington, D.C. in July of 1932. They built shanty towns while they waited for Congress to meet their demands. However, on July 28th, Washington police attempted to clear the demonstrators and their camps out of the capital, but without any success. Fearing rising disorder, President Hoover ordered an army regiment under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur to assist the police. MacArthur will use infantry, cavalry, and tanks to force the veterans. Remember, veterans of World War I, veterans who possibly served with a lot of these men, to flee the nation's capital. And then we'll see that MacArthur then ordered the shanty settlements burned. This marks the chaos of the period when we have Army servicemen acting against Army veterans in order to gain or get control over situations. This is the conflict that is starting to pit American against American as the economy collapses. But there was a glimmer of hope over the horizon. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, the distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, ran for the presidency. Now, Roosevelt served as Secretary of the Navy and spent 2 terms as governor of New York, and this earned him a reputation as a reformer. Although from one of America's wealthiest families, the onset of polio in 1921 appeared to help him understand the difficulties of the working class. This onset of his polio occurred around the age of 39 years old, and he taught himself to walk short distances while wearing braces, careful to never be seen using his wheelchair in public. For the most part, in trying to cover up his illness, he endured great pain from the iron braces in order to maintain the illusion of complete health to the public. The illness was known among some Americans before and during his presidency. However, the extent of his paralysis was kept from the public view. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, would also represent a new age of women in America. She was the niece of Theodore Roosevelt when she married Franklin Roosevelt in 1905. Yes, kind of a little bit on the weird side there. During her husband's presidency, Eleanor challenged the established roles of the American First Lady. One of the first influential First Ladies in American history, she is going to be tied with numerous movements and causes. Eleanor gave press conferences and wrote a newspaper column. She tended to focus on helping the country's poor and stood against racial discrimination. Privately, she became known as the legs of the president, going places where his polio prevented him from access. It is important to keep in mind that Roosevelt's presidency was a period of great crisis that would challenge the U.S. Constitution regarding the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. This was only experienced once before during the American Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln was required to use the full commander-in-chief role of the U.S. president. The urgency of the Great Depression required special actions and rapid implementation of policies and the resulting programs that came with those policies. It relied heavily on the executive actions by the president, though we need to keep in mind that he always maintained the support of Congress, and that Congress maintained the power to remove his actions or deny him the actions that he was taking. It will forever change the way people view the role of the executive branch and its power. We need to keep in mind that it created an unrealistic set of expectations of the presidency that tended to violate the Constitution. And we also see that it will motivate possible excesses of the future presidents, also in violation of the Constitution. By 1933, between 12.6 million, which would be over 1/4 of the population, and 16 million, which would be over 1/3 of the American population, were unemployed. During his inaugural speech on March 3rd of 1933, Roosevelt declared that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. This defined his optimism and aggressive nature, which brought some comfort to many regarding the government's potential. The day after his inauguration, FDR closed the banks for 4 days. He called this a bank holiday, which in essence ended the run on the banks and gave people time to reconsider their situation. He recalled Congress for a special session to push for unemployment assistance, farm aid, and to examine the banking system and where the changes needed to be made. Unlike previous presidents, we will see how FDR is going to use the medium of radio to become closer to the American people and to kind of calm their fears. The Fireside Chats were a series of 31 evening radio addresses delivered by FDR between 1933 and 1944. On the radio, Roosevelt appealed to the American people's need for information and reassurance. FDR discussed the steps the government intended to enact and the programs it was creating. He spoke plainly to the public about national concerns and the policies related to them. The Fireside Chats became a staple of his administration, causing many to view him as the people's president. This revolutionized the way presidents communicated by demonstrating the power of direct engagement with the public through mass media. President and Congress enacted measures that created numerous federal programs to help the country recover from economic trouble. He employed thousands of Americans to improve the nation's infrastructure and protect the environment. His primary goals were to provide government-sponsored employment to stabilize purchasing power, which he hoped would revive the economy. He also provided loans to the states in order to operate relief programs. To address the troublesome practices of the banking system, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act, which gave the president broad discretionary power over all banking transactions and foreign exchanges, limited only to the period of the economic crisis. Again, this is where we're seeing that Congress is limiting the scope of his power, but at the same time giving the president far more power than what was normal during the period. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 separated commercial banks under the Federal Reserve from private companies, security firms, and investment banks. In essence, they removed the speculative investments from commercial banks, thus protecting the consumers. Roosevelt's New Deal appeared to be the answer to the nation's problems, but it hid a dangerous reality from the general public. The new jobs and services lacked real financial support of an improving economic recovery. Businesses remained in the red. Trade remained stagnant. The United States and other countries were printing technically valueless money to avoid additional panic. Though the economy was improving in perception, it was not improving in reality. And eventually the economy would collapse once again, unless something came along to pull the nation and the rest of the world out of its economic difficulties. Fearing a greater threat from the political left, FDR embarked on a second New Deal. He focused on increasing worker protections, expanding relief programs, and establishing long-term financial security. Through the second New Deal, he created the Social Security Act, which provided unemployment compensation, old age pensions, and aid for dependent mothers and children funded by payroll taxes. However, it excluded more than 1/4 of all Americans. The National Labor Relations Act established a federal committee of the right to organize and bargain collectively through trade unions. The Fair Labor Standards Act set a national minimum wage, maximum work week, and placed restrictions on child labor. Deal coalition included traditional-minded white Southern Democrats, big city political machines, industrial workers of all races, and trade unionists and farmers. Understand that this was a combination of people who tended not to like each other, but were willing to work with each other in order to get the country back on its feet. Their cooperation pushed Roosevelt into his second presidential term in 1936, carrying all but two U.S. states. Unfortunately for the United States and Canada, the Great Depression were not their only problems. The rapid mechanization of farm equipment contributed to farmers converting thousands of acres of arid grassland into cultivated cropland, thus increasing their revenues. Unfortunately, by plowing up the virgin soil, displacing the native deep-rooted grasses that trap soil and moisture, as well as exposing the land to high winds and droughts, corporate farmers triggered an environmental crisis in the 1930s. Understand that these farmers have been warned by the scientific community, but ignored these warnings, and unfortunately, the scientists proved to be right. In what became known as the Dirty 30s, we're going to see that over a period of several years, constant severe dust storms damaged the ecology and the agriculture of the U.S. and the Canadian prairies. Over 3 million people abandoned the Midwest to escape the poor conditions that they were facing under these conditions. As you can see through these pictures, the environmental crisis was staggering. These were not just minor dust storms. These were dust storms that occurred over and over and had the capability, as you can see, of burying houses, cars, and killing livestock, and literally turning states like Oklahoma and Kansas into the dust bowls of that period. Cannot underestimate the need and the desire of people to evacuate these areas and try to find new places to live amongst a country that was already hurting from a lack of jobs and a lack of opportunities. In light of this, the federal government is going to step into farming. They're going to resettle displaced farmers. They're going to implement laws and programs in order to restore the water sources. They're going to provide loans to the failing farms and reduce crop surplus and therefore effectively raising the value of crops. The Farm Security Administration, the FSA, was established within the Department of Agriculture in order to support impoverished farmers during the Great Depression. The Emergency Farm Mortgage Act provided funding for refinancing mortgages to help farmers facing foreclosure of their properties. And the Soil Conservation Service, the SCS, was established to teach farmers soil conservation techniques and promote practices to prevent erosion. We look at some of the pictures of the period, we can see the desperation that these people were facing and the horrible living conditions that they were forced to endure. In this photograph, we have a migrant mother and her children sitting in a pea pickers camp in California. Image. We see a resident of Pipe City, where homeless men created a community called Pipe City, also known as Miseryville, located in Oakland, California. They used surplus sewer pipes from the American Concrete and Steel Pipe Company in order to create makeshift homes. In this image, we have a family standing outside their car, leaving their failed farm in hopes of finding work in California. Of the 500,000 people who fled the southern plains, some 200,000 will migrate to California. In the midst of all this chaos, the tensions between Anglo-Americans and African Americans grew. And we see this in what became known as the Scottsboro Boys trials. 9 black teenagers were accused in Scottsboro, Alabama, of raping 2 white women on a train in 1931. On April 9th of 1931, 8 of the 9 men were convicted and sentenced to death. Protests in the North led the Supreme Court to overturn the convictions in 1932. The landmark set of legal cases stemming from this incident addressed racism and the right to a fair trial for African Americans and all minorities in America. It frequently is cited as an example of miscarriage of justice in the United States legal system. Eventually, the two women admitted to falsifying their reports, but law enforcement and the district attorney's office would not drop the charges. And over a period of 80 years, the children were all pardoned for their crimes, but several died before they were ever cleared of these charges. Many of the trials during this period that fought for the civil rights of Americans were fought by the American Communist Party. The CPUSA was established in 1919 in Chicago, Illinois, after a split in the Socialist Party of America. Now, this party was tied with the U.S. labor movement, and the histories of communist parties nationwide. The party faced significant government suppression during the Red Scares of 1919 through 1921 and the McCarthy era in the 1950s. But during the 1930s and the 1940s, the CPUSA reached its peak of influence within the labor movement and in advocating for civil rights. It will play a role in organizing industrial unions and campaigning against Jim Crow laws. It will assist in the legal fees for the Scottsboro Boys. Also, it will organize sharecroppers and tenant farmers in Alabama to force landlords to give a fair share of their income. Time progressed, many viewed FDR's actions as overstepping his established executive limits. It is during this period that we see that Congress starts checking the power of FDR and at the same time demonstrating the effectiveness of the government and its willingness to adhere to the Constitution. FDR's newly created restrictions on corporations, banking institutions, and Wall Street angered those who benefited from the old systems. His rivals on the political right painted the president as a dictator wanting complete power over the country by subverting the Constitution, while his challengers on the political left accused him of being too timid. Overall, the New Deal led to a significant political realignment of the Democratic and Republican parties, with a solidifying of a liberal coalition. Those changes would mark a shift in the two parties' ideology between 1947 and 1968, something that we'll discuss in the next section. Facing constant opposition within the Supreme Court, FDR sought to increase the number of his Supreme Justices. Now, he aimed to add new justices within the Supreme Court to the Supreme Court in order to neutralize the conservative opposition to his New Deal legislation. He kind of was hoping that the additional justices would swing support in his favor. Now, this plan involved the Judicial Procedure Reform Bill of 1937, which would have allowed the president to appoint an additional justice for each sitting justice over the age of 70 who wouldn't retire. Now, for the most part, he was trying to stack the Supreme Court in his favor. And many realized this, and he failed to gain the backing of the general public and any support or any notable support from the press. Critics argued that it threatened the independence of the judiciary and the balance of powers. And it further pushed the belief that he sought to gain complete control over the American government. In addition to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, the United States would also see an end to airships in America. Now, despite a long history of accidents worldwide, Americans and Europeans sought to establish airships as the pinnacle of flight. For the most part, winged flight remained in its development state, and it tended to be loud, slow, unreliable, and not very comfortable. So airships gained favor both in the military and commercially as they were quieter, more comfortable, and their grand scale was also visually enticing for customers. For the Navy, the airship allowed a platform for observation to assist sea ships, naval ships, to find and track enemy movements out at sea. As a matter of fact, the blimps were so large, and the technology at the time actually had created a method for smaller airplanes to not only launch but also be recovered upon these airships. However, both commercial and naval versions of the airships were under constant threat of extreme weather. High winds would basically remove any ability of the ship to maintain controlled flight. And what we're going to see is by 1935, 4 of the U.S. Navy's 5 naval airships had suffered deadly accidents resulting in their complete destruction. We'll see that over 75 naval personnel are going to be killed in these accidents. To add to this, in 1937, the German airship Hindenburg will explode over Lakehurst, New Jersey, killing 36 passengers and crew. And we'll see at this point that the global age of airship will end. As we get closer to the 1940s, we need to note that the Great Depression revised attitudes, concerns, and discourse, which contributed to World War I. This was seen in the increase of nationalistic zeal, the rise of extremist groups, and the discord within the political systems throughout Europe. The relative calm achieved after World War I began to dissipate as tensions grew between the European countries. Events in Italy, Germany, and the Soviet Union raised concerns worldwide. In Germany, Italy, and Japan, their governments began a military buildup through programs similar to FDR's New Deal. And eventually, they would use their expanded and modernized military against their weaker neighbors, moving the world closer to a Second World War. By 1937, the economic depression seemed to be coming to an end. The economy grew by 5.1%. Roosevelt sought to reduce funding for the New Deal projects. As of 1938, the Great Depression was at an end. Unemployment is still at a 19% high. Defense spending, though, starts to increase, which opens new jobs and opportunities as America gets closer to war. Despite the conservative parties gaining popularity in opposition to FDR, the new external threats brought the two sides closer together. FDR, the primary historical agent of the American Depression era, soon became the key player in the United States' national security. Please remember that war, not social, economic, or political policies, pulled the country out of the Depression. World War II saved the world from economic collapse, but cost millions of lives worldwide. The world as it had been for thousands of years was soon to change with the Second World War.